Cadia Prime, the fourth planet of the system, located deep within Segmentum Obscurus, holds the status of an Alpha-class fortress world in administratum registries. However, this dry term fails to fully reflect the planet's role. High Command assesses the strategic significance of this asset as absolute and critical to the very existence of the Imperium. The planet's uniqueness is dictated not by resources or climate, but solely by astrography. Cadia is situated on the edge of the Eye of Terror, a giant warp rift, an eternal wound on the galaxy's body. It is here that the only stable corridor lies, the so-called Cadian Gate, allowing large military fleets to traverse safely between the immaterium and real space. Any attempts to bypass this system doom ships to destruction in unpredictable warp storms. Thus, control over Cadia effectively means control over the only entrance and exit to the Citadel of Chaos. Historical chronicles testify that the Imperium turned its attention to this world 40 standard years before the onset of the Horus Heresy. At the close of the 30th millennium, Cadia was inhabited by degraded tribes stuck at a primitive level of development. Even then, a characteristic genetic mutation of the local population was recorded: purple irises, a consequence of proximity to warp energies. First contact with the planet was established by the 17th Astartes Aegon, the Word-Bearers, under the personal command of Primarch Lorgar. Reconnaissance revealed alarming coincidences between local beliefs and the ancient chaos cults of Colchis. It was on the surface of Cadia that a dark ritual was performed to summon the demonic entity Ingetel, which became the point of no return in Lorgar's fall. To hide traces of contact with the ruinous powers, the Primarch ordered the genocide of the indigenous population. The planet was officially declared cleared for colonization, but in fact remained a desolate wasteland until the end of the heresy. Full-scale development and militarization of Cadia began only in the early 32nd millennium. The catalyst was the first Black Crusade of Abaddon the Despoiler, which vividly demonstrated the vulnerability of this sector. The arriving colonists, who became the ancestors of modern Cadians, over time acquired the same distinctive trait as their predecessors, purple eyes, which became the calling card of the Gate's defenders. Over millennia of war, the planet's fortification doctrine underwent radical evolution. The initial architecture, copying the Terran style of high spires, proved its untenability during the Second Black Crusade. Cities of the old type proved impossible to hold under conditions of total siege. By 999.M41, Cadia Prime had transformed into a single monolithic defensive complex. All settlements were rebuilt into autonomous fortress cities designated as cars. A typical cars is a triumph of military engineering. Its layout precludes chaotic construction. Streets form geometrically precise sectors of death designed for crossfire. The perimeter of each city is protected by a defense in depth. External earthen ramparts give way to anti-tank ditches, beyond which rise walls of ferrocrete reinforced with adamantium bulkheads. Entrances are controlled by drawbridges powered by independent generators. However, the main element of defense is void shields of industrial grade. Provided the reactors operate stably, these fields can withstand direct orbital bombardment indefinitely. The internal structure of a cars is also subordinate to war. Every residential building is a strongpoint with firing ports. Roofs are reinforced for the landing of assault Valkyries, and basement levels constitute a network of bunkers with supplies calculated for years of autonomous siege. The central citadel can function even if the outer defense rings fall. On Cadia, there is no concept of rear or peaceful zone. The entire surface of the planet, from icy tundra to heathland wastes, is marked by command as a potential and inevitable theater of military operations. If the Cassars form the skeletal structure of the planet's defense, then its population is the muscle and blood that drives the system. Sociological analysis of Cadian society reveals the complete subordination of civilian life to military needs. This is not merely a militarized zone, but a society of total mobilization. Administratum statistics at the close of the 41st millennium indicate that 72% of Cadia's population was listed as active military personnel. The remaining 28% constituted technical staff employed in weapons production and logistics. Birth rates on the planet were artificially synchronized with the demands of the Departamento Munitorum, ensuring a continuous stream of recruits to replenish inevitable losses. The process of indoctrination and combat training begins in early childhood. According to Cadian educational standards, the skill of field stripping and reassembling a lasgun is instilled in a child before the skill of reading. By the age of 10, every citizen is required to pass qualification survival trials. Groups of teenagers are dropped onto isolated islands of the Mare archipelago or into desert zones, where they are obligated to function autonomously for a standard month. Those who fail this stage are culled as unfit for service in line units. Upon reaching adolescence, Cadians are enrolled in the youth armies, known as White Shields. It is here that the formation of a soldier's psychology is completed. Any day not dedicated to training with live ammunition is considered a day wasted. The planet's military doctrine does not recognize theoretical classroom instruction. Officer cadres, including those from the aristocracy, receive promotions exclusively through combat experience on the front lines. Cadia is the largest exporter of elite infantry in the segmentum. About half of the total combat-capable population is deployed to Cadian shock trooper regiments to participate in campaigns on other worlds. Repatriation statistics are relentless. According to Munitorum data, only one soldier out of every 1,000 sent returns to their home planet. The social hierarchy of the society is built upon a strict army model. A citizen's status depends directly on their rank and combat merit, not on lineage or wealth. Even the position of planetary ruler bears the title Governor Primus, implying the authority of a supreme commander. In crisis situations, power transfers to the Lord Castellan, whose authority is effectively limitless. Cadia's economic model is also unique. The planet is officially exempt from paying the imperial tithe in monetary or resource equivalents. Its only currency, with which it pays terra, is regiments of the guard and the output of military manufactoriums. The industrial sector operates at maximum capacity, making the system the largest supplier of munitions and heavy machinery in the region. The utilitarian attitude toward human resources is most starkly illustrated by the so-called law of decipherability. Due to high mortality rates and limited territory, burial space on Cadia is a scarce resource. Special ecclesiarchy ministers regularly inspect cemeteries. As soon as the inscription on a tombstone is erased by time and becomes illegible, the remains are exhumed and moved to mass graves. The official interpretation states, those whose names are forgotten require no reverence, and the land must serve the needs of the living defenders. Thus, every aspect of a Cadian's life, from birth to death, is subordinated to a single purpose: war. The strategic value of Cadia is secured not only by the courage of its defenders or the thickness of the Cassar walls. The planet's key asset, making the existence of the Cadian Gate physically possible, is a network of ancient megastructures designated in imperial archives as pylons. These colossal monoliths are scattered across the entire surface of the planet, forming complex geometric clusters. According to Auspex scan data, the average height of the above-ground section of a pylon reaches 500 meters, while another quarter kilometer of the structure extends deep into the lithosphere.
The structures consist of an unknown black material, classified by the Magos of the Adeptus Mechanicus as noctilith, or black stone. The surface of the monoliths is absolutely smooth, resistant to erosion and any conventional impact, and pierced by a system of through holes of various diameters. Field reports note that the wind passing through these channels creates a specific acoustic effect, a continuous eerie howl that has become background noise for the residents of Cadia. As of 999.M41, the planetary network numbered about 6,000 fully functional objects and over 2,000 partially destroyed or buried underground as a result of tectonic shifts. The nature and purpose of these structures remained the subject of unsuccessful research by the tech priesthood for centuries. Any attempts to penetrate inside the structures ended in failure. Servitors and probes sent into the pylon channels instantly malfunctioned. Analysis of the surface using laser drills and plasma cutters also yielded no results. The material demonstrated absolute inertness. However, their functional impact on reality was established empirically. A group of pylons generates a stable anti-psychic field known as the zone of silence. These fields suppress warp activity, acting as breakwaters against the storms of the immaterium. It is the functioning of the pylon network that artificially maintains the stability of the Cadian gate, preventing the Eye of Terror from swallowing the system. Xenoarchaeological dating, conducted using forbidden technologies, indicates that these objects were erected over 65 million years ago, long before the emergence of humanity. Their architecture and the properties of the noctilith material have direct matches with technological specimens of the Necron race. Thus, the defense of Cadia was waged on land that was itself an ancient alien containment mechanism, the operating principle of which remained a mystery even to those who gave their lives for its protection.
In the final months of 999.M41, the strategic situation in Segmentum Obscurus began to degrade rapidly. Intelligence data indicated the onset of the 13th Black Crusade, the largest offensive operation by Chaos forces since the Heresy. Abaddon the Despoiler's plan, intercepted by Imperial intelligence under the codename the Crimson Path, implied not merely military expansion, but the systematic destruction of warp containment infrastructure. Primary signs of the invasion manifested in the anomalous activity of the pylon network. The ancient monoliths began radiating intense psychic energy, reacting to critical pressure from the Eye of Terror. Tech priests recorded microfractures in the structures and ground vibrations, testifying to the system being pushed to its limit. Concurrently, sightings of space hulks, drifting conglomerates of dead ships used by Chaos forces as transport vessels, became more frequent in the sector. The first blow was struck not against Cadia itself, but against the adjacent Agrippina sector. The Death Guard fleet, under the command of Typhus the Traveler, led by the flagship Terminus Est, initiated a biological attack. Strains of the zombie plague were dispersed over densely populated hive worlds. The epidemic led to the collapse of civil administration and mass uprisings of cults, preaching that the pestilence was the Emperor's punishment. This maneuver forced Segmentum Command to disperse fleet forces for quarantine measures, weakening Cadia's orbital grouping. However, the most critical blow was struck from within the security perimeter. In response to the growing threat, the High Command of Cadia initiated a protocol of total mobilization, calling for aid from Imperial Guard regiments from other sectors. One of the arriving units was the Volscani Cataphracts Regiment, an elite heavy infantry formation that held an impeccable reputation.
The deployment of the Volscani took place on the Tyrock fields. The planet's entire high command staff, including the Governor Primus, gathered to formally welcome the arriving forces. During the ceremonial march past, the personnel of the cataphracts who had defected to Chaos in advance opened fire with intent to kill on the command stands. During the incident, the governor and most of the general staff were liquidated in the first minutes of combat. The planet's decapitated defense teetered on the brink of disorganization. The situation was saved by Colonel Ursakar E. Creed of the Cadian 8th Regiment. Assuming command under emergency conditions, he managed to regroup loyal units and organize a counterattack. The operation to liquidate the traitors on the Tyrock fields ended with the total destruction of the Volscani cataphracts. Given the loss of the legitimate government, the Field Council of Officers conferred the rank of Lord Castellan of Cadia to Ursakar Creed. He was granted dictatorial powers to coordinate the defense. Thus, by the moment Abaddon's main fleet exited the warp, Cadia was already in a state of internal war, with destroyed government and depleted reserves, but under unified, rigid military control.
With the suppression of the internal rebellion, the operational pause came to an end. The main invasion fleet emerged from the Eye of Terror under the banner of the Black Legion. Abaddon, the despoiler's armada, numbered hundreds of vessels, including despoiler-class battlecruisers, heavy carriers, and Heresy-era grand cruisers. The core of the strike group consisted of super-heavy assets: Abaddon's flagship, the Vengeful Spirit; the specialized world destroyer, the Planet Killer, equipped with the Armageddon gun; and the Blackstone Fortress, Will of Eternity, an ancient space citadel whose firepower is comparable to the combined salvo of an entire Imperial fleet. The battle for high orbit was fierce but short-lived. Despite the heroism of the Imperial Navy crews, the enemy's numerical and technical superiority was overwhelming. According to combat logs, organized resistance in orbit was broken within 72 standard hours. The remaining Loyalist ships were either destroyed or forced to retreat to the system's edge to regroup. Having seized space superiority, Abaddon initiated the first stage of the planetary assault. Cadia was subjected to massive orbital bombardment. Lance batteries and macro cannons methodically destroyed infrastructure outside the Caesar's void shields. The planet's landscape, already harsh, was turned into a scorched radioactive desert. Immediately following the preliminary bombardment, the troop landing began. The skies of Cadia were filled with thousands of drop pods and heavy transports. Contingents of Chaos Space Marines from various warbands, traitor guard regiments, and daemon engines were landed on the surface. The landing of Legio Vulcanum, title Death's Heads, and Legio Mortis posed a particular threat. The Chaos God Machines entered into a duel with the garrison titans of Legio Ignatum, protecting the approaches to the fortress cities. The situation was assessed as catastrophic. Defenders were trapped inside the Caesars, and communications between cities were severed. The fall of Cadia seemed a matter of time. However, the strategic balance was temporarily restored by the arrival of an Adeptus Astartes reinforcement fleet. Dozens of chapters answered the call for aid. In the vanguard of the counterstrike were the Space Wolves under the command of Great Wolf Logan Grimnar and the Dark Angels led by Supreme Grand Master Azrael. In the face of the threat of annihilation, the ancient rivalry between the chapters was cast aside. Arriving with them in the system were the Black Templars, Crimson Fists, and other successors of Dorn.
The element of surprise allowed the Loyalists to break the blockade and deploy their forces directly into the combat zones. Deserving of special mention is the anomalous reinforcement in the form of the Space Wolves' 13th Great Company. This unit, considered lost in the Eye of Terror since the Horus Heresy, emerged from warp portals directly on the planet's surface, striking the rear of the Chaos forces. The appearance of the Wolfen, mutated yet loyal Astartes, sowed chaos in the ranks of the attackers and allowed the front to be stabilized, shifting the conflict into a protracted positional war of attrition.
While positional warfare was waged on Cadia's surface, a second, hidden phase of Abaddon's plan was unfolding in adjacent star systems based on the use of esoteric and thaumaturgic methods of warfare. According to intelligence, the 17th Legion, Word-Bearers, under the operational command of Dark Apostle Erebus, did not take active part in the assault on the Citadel itself. Their task was conducting a series of large-scale rituals on peripheral, already conquered planets of the sector. The goal of these actions was not military suppression, but the creation of a psycho-spiritual resonance. By sacrificing millions of civilians, the Word-Bearers provoked a critical destabilization of the Immaterium. The result was achieved immediately. The Eye of Terror began to pulsate, spawning warp storms of unprecedented power. Rapidly, interstellar navigation in the region became impossible. Astropathic communication was completely blocked by the white noise of the warp. Segmentum Obscurus found itself de facto isolated from Terra and the rest of the Imperium. Logistical chains were severed. The defenders of Cadia lost the ability to receive ammunition and reinforcements, finding themselves in a strategic vacuum. Taking advantage of the disorganization of the Loyalist fleet, the Black Legion switched to scorched earth tactics, destroying neighboring systems unopposed. However, the main threat materialized in Cadia's low orbit. The flagship super heavy ship Planet Killer entered the combat zone. Scanning confirmed the activation of its main battery, the Armageddon gun, the power of which is sufficient to destroy the planetary crust and mantle. Simultaneously, the Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity moved into strike position. This was one of 6 known ancient artifacts of this class captured by Abaddon earlier. Control of the fortress was maintained remotely via the Eye of Night and Hand of Darkness artifacts. Technical analysis of the threat showed that the Will of Eternity accumulates warp energy, focusing it into a disintegration beam. The calculations of the tech priests were grim. Even the combined power of all Cadia's void shield generators could not withstand a direct hit from a beam of such intensity. The situation was aggravated by external factors. A splinter of Tyrannid Hive Fleet Leviathan invaded the sector, drawn by the biomass of the war, as well as a large Orc Wa seeking to join the conflict. Thus, by the middle of the siege, the position of the defenders had become hopeless. Isolated, surrounded by superior forces of Xenos and Chaos, and in the crosshairs of doomsday weapons, the Cadians and their allies prepared for the inevitable destruction of their world.
At the moment when the destruction of Cadia seemed inevitable, an unaccounted variable was introduced into the conflict's equation: Xenos intervention. A subject identified as Trazyn the Infinite, overlord of the Nihilak dynasty, Necron race, arrived in the combat zone. According to motif analysis, his actions were not dictated by altruism. Trazyn, known as a collector of historical artifacts, viewed the fall of Cadia and the expansion of the Eye of Terror as a threat to the preservation of his collection and the galaxy as a whole. In parallel, Archmagos Dominus Belisarius Call arrived on the planet. Having gained access to secret data, he realized the true nature of the pylons. Facing total annihilation, Cole made an unprecedented decision to enter into a tactical alliance with the Xenos. Despite the dogmas of the cult Mechanicus prohibiting such contact as tech heresy, Cole and Trazyn began joint work in the underground catacombs beneath Kars Kraf. Their goal was the recalibration and full activation of the pylon network to close the Eye of Terror. Meanwhile, in orbit, the situation reached a critical point. The Blackstone Fortress Will of Eternity completed its weapon-charging cycle. The Imperial Navy, having suffered catastrophic losses, possessed no means to intercept or destroy an object of such tonnage. The turning point in the space battle came with the sudden emergence from the warp of the Imperial Fist's mobile fortress monastery, the Phalanx. This ship, a relic of the Great Crusade era, possessed firepower comparable to a small moon. The arrival of the Phalanx was made possible by the navigational aid of the Legion of the Damned, who guided the vessel through the warp storms. However, the Blackstone Fortress's void shields rendered it invulnerable even to the guns of the Phalanx. To resolve this, a suicidal boarding operation was initiated. A detachment of Space Wolves, under the command of Wolf Lord Sven Bloodhowl, executed a ramming assault onto the fortress's hull. Fighting their way to the shield generators, the Astartes disabled the defenses at the cost of their own lives. Stripped of its defenses, the Will of Eternity was immediately attacked by the Phalanx's main batteries. A massive salvo shattered the ancient station's structure. Critical damage led to the detonation of the warp core and the fracturing of the object. The destruction of the Will of Eternity and the neutralization of Abaddon's flagship, the Planet Killer, which was forced to retreat after sustaining damage, compelled the Chaos Fleet to temporarily break contact. The Doomsday weapon was neutralized, and the immediate threat of Exterminatus postponed. The defenders of Cadia received a temporary respite. However, the debris of the destroyed fortress remained in orbit, forming an asteroid belt whose trajectory still posed a potential threat to the planet's gravity well.
The loss of the flagship and the destruction of the Will of Eternity forced Abaddon the Despoiler to alter his operational doctrine. Abandoning the concept of remote planetary annihilation, the War Master of Chaos initiated the Decapitation Protocol. The main strike was redirected at the last surviving bastion of defense, Cassar Kraf, where Lord Castellan Creed's headquarters and Archmagos Cole's engineering group were located. The second wave of the assault began with the mass teleportation of elite Black Legion Terminator units, the Bringers of Despair retinue, directly into the Citadel's perimeter. Abaddon led the attack personally. His objective was the liquidation of the Loyalist command staff. Breaking into the command tower, the Despoiler found only Jaren Kell, Creed's color sergeant and aide-de-camp. Kell engaged in a doomed battle with Abaddon, sacrificing himself to buy time for the Lord Castellan's evacuation and the regrouping of forces. The center of gravity of the battle shifted to the subterranean levels of Cassar Kraf, to the Elysian caves, where the roots of the pylons were located. Chaos forces, reinforced by demonic entities, breached the outer defensive perimeter, threatening to interrupt the work of Belisarius Cawl and Trazyn to activate the network. At a critical moment in the defense, Trazyn the Infinite deployed a Tesseract Labyrinth-class artifact. Historical combat units that were part of the Necron's collection were released from the pocket dimension onto the battlefield. Among them were identified squads of Heresy-era Ultramarines and Salamanders, a regiment of Vostroyan Firstborn, a Tanith Imperial Guard regiment, and Inquisitor Greyfax, who was considered missing in action. This anomalous reinforcement temporarily held back the onslaught, yet the enemy's numerical superiority remained overwhelming.
The turning point came the moment the pylon calibration was completed. Archmago's call initiated the network launch at 100% capacity. The activation effect was global. The pylons generated an anti-psychic shockwave that blanketed the entire planet. The zone of silence led to instantaneous destabilization of warp matter. Demonic entities sustained by the energy of the immaterium were forcibly disembodied and banished back into the warp. Psychers on both sides lost their abilities or died from neural shock. The visually observable eye of terror began to contract, losing its intensity of glow. However, the activation also had a negative tactical effect for the Loyalists. Saint Celestine, the living saint, and the warriors of the Legion of the Damned, whose nature is also tied to warp energies, lost their power. Celestine became vulnerable, stripped of her divine protection. Seizing this opportunity, Abaddon, retaining the physical might of a genetically modified Primarch, attempted to finish off the exhausted defenders. Nevertheless, a coordinated counterattack led by Ursakar Creed, Katarina Greyfax, and the wounded Celestine inflicted critical damage to the despoiler. Having sustained heavy wounds and realizing that the pylons were blocking his connection to the Chaos Gods and the fleet, Abaddon was forced to activate his emergency teleport. The invasion leader left the planet's surface, returning aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The ground battle was formally won by the Imperium. The demons were banished, and the enemy general had retreated. However, the strategic initiative remained in the hands of the Black Legion, who controlled the orbit.
Abaddon's tactical retreat to orbit did not signify the cessation of hostilities. Realizing that the pylon network successfully blocked warp support and rendered a ground victory impossible, the despoiler applied an alternative strategy of total annihilation. Standing on the bridge of the Vengeful Spirit, the War Master issued an order that forever changed the map of the galaxy. The engines of escort ships were attached to the largest fragments of the previously destroyed Blackstone Fortress, Will of Eternity. Adjusting the trajectory, the Chaos Fleet directed millions of tons of the ancient station's debris directly onto the surface of Cadia. The impact occurred in the region of the equatorial belt. The kinetic energy of the strike was comparable to the detonation of the planet's entire nuclear arsenal. The consequences were of an irreversible geological nature. The planet's tectonic plates were destabilized, the crust began to crumble, and the mantle breached the surface. The shockwave and earthquakes led to the physical destruction of the pylon network. As soon as the monoliths collapsed, the anti-psychic field of the zone of silence dissipated. The Eye of Terror, no longer restrained by Necron technology, instantly expanded, consuming reality. Under conditions of incipient planetary disintegration, Imperial Command initiated Emergency Evacuation Protocol Magna. The operation was conducted in conditions of total chaos. Imperial Navy transport vessels executed landings in zones of volcanic activity, attempting to retrieve the maximum amount of personnel and civilians. Unlike the Loyalists, the Black Legion simply left the system, abandoning millions of their cultists, traitor guardsmen, and mutants on the dying planet. The defense of the landing zones fell upon the shoulders of Lord Castellan Ursakar Creed and the Cadian 8th Regiment. Realizing that space on the transports was limited, Creed made the decision to remain in the rearguard. His fighters held the perimeter against the returning demonic hordes, buying precious minutes for the takeoff of the last shuttles. Saint Celestine, whose powers were restored after the fall of the pylons, led the evacuation fleet's breakout through the Chaos blockade. Lord Castellan Ursakar Creed is officially listed as missing in action, status MIA. Field reports do not confirm the fact of his death. His body was not recovered.
there exists a high probability that in the final moments of Cadia's existence, the Xenos archivist Trazyn intervened in the general's fate. However, this information is of a speculative nature. The final evacuation statistics are catastrophic. Of the fortress world's population numbering in the billions, fewer than 3 million people were successfully extracted, including military personnel and civilian refugees. Cadia Prime ceased to exist as a physical object. However, despite the physical destruction of the lithosphere, the strategic objective of preserving the combat core of the Cadian regiments was partially fulfilled.
The destruction of Cadia Prime became not merely the loss of a key fortress, but the trigger for a geopolitical catastrophe of galactic scale. With the destruction of the pylon network, the containment barrier between reality and the immaterium ceased to exist. Warp storms, previously localized within the Eye of Terror, instantly spread along the crimson path forged by Abaddon. A giant anomaly formed, receiving the name Cicatrix Maledictum, or the Great Rift. This wound divided humanity's domains into two parts: Imperium Sanctus, territory where the light of the Astronomicon is visible, and Imperium Nihilus, the Dark Imperium, where navigation became practically impossible and communication with Terra was lost. Thus, the strategic plan of Abaddon the Despoiler must be recognized as successful. Despite a tactical defeat in the ground battle and the inability to capture the planet intact, he fulfilled the main objective. He liquidated the warp containment mechanism and struck a blow to the heart of the Imperium. The fate of the Cadian evacuation fleet was also critical. The convoy of survivors pursued by the Black Legion was forced to retreat into deep space. Salvation came from the Eldar faction known as the Ynnari. Using the Webway network, the Xenos helped the fleet remnants reach the Ultramar system. The surviving defenders of Cadia, including Belisarius Cawl and Saint Celestine, played a key role in the subsequent events on Macragge, which led to the resurrection of Primarch Robute Guliman. Despite the physical absence of the planet, the Imperium did not disband the Cadian regiments. On the contrary, a new ideological doctrine was adopted. Cadia ceased to be a geographical point on a map and transformed into a concept. Regiments continue to be raised on other worlds according to Cadian standards, and surviving veterans are distributed as instructors. The imperative phrase entered the official lexicon of the Astra Militarum: Cadia stands. It is interpreted literally. As long as even one soldier of a Cadian regiment lives, the fortress is considered not to have fallen. End of entry. Archive closed.